Industrialism, progress or decline. In 1835 the French statesman and author Alexis de Tocqueville wrote of Manchester, "From this foul drain, the greatest stream of human industry flows out to fertilize the whole world. From this filthy sewer pure gold flows. Here humanity attains its most complete development and its most brutish, here civilization works its miracles and civilized man is turned almost into a savage." De Tocqueville's graphic sense of the wealth and the wretchedness that the Industrial Revolution had created epitomized contemporary responses to the way in which manufacturing had transformed 19th century England. Victorians debated whether the machine age was a blessing or a curse, whether the economic system was making humanity happier or more miserable. Did the Industrial Revolution represent progress, and how, in fact, was progress to be defined? The Industrial Revolution was the result of a complex set of causes, none of which, by itself, could have given rise to the phenomenon. The crucial technological innovations would have meant little without notable population growth, an increase in agricultural efficiency that released much of the workforce from field labor, and key economic changes, such as greater mobility of capital. Transformations in the production of textiles led to the first and most dramatic break with age-old practices. First powered by hand, or sometimes by water, machinery to speed up spinning and weaving processes was developed in England in the 18th century. By the 1780s manufacturers were installing steam engines, newly improved by James Watt, in large buildings called mills or factories. Mill towns, producing cotton or woolen cloth for the world's markets, grew quickly in northern England. The population of the city of Manchester, for example, increased tenfold in the years between 1760 and 1830. The development of the railways in the 1830s initiated a new phase in the industrial age, marked by an enormous expansion in the production of iron and coal. By the beginning of the Victorian period, the Industrial Revolution had already created profound economic and social changes. Hundreds of thousands of workers had migrated to the industrial towns, where they lived in horribly crowded, unsanitary housing and labored very long hours, 14 a day or more at very low wages. Employers often preferred to hire women and children, who worked for even less money than men. Moved by the terrible suffering of the workers, which was intensified by a severe depression in the early 1840s, writers and legislators drew increasingly urgent attention to the condition of the working class. A number of parliamentary committees and commissions in the 1830s and 1840s introduced testimony about working conditions in mines and factories that led to the beginning of government regulation and inspection, particularly of the working conditions of women and children. Other eyewitness accounts created a growing consciousness of the plight of the workers. In the condition of the working class, 1845, Friedrich Engels described the conclusions he drew in the 20 months he spent observing industrial conditions in Manchester. In a series of interviews written for the Mom Chronicle, 1849-52, later published as London Labour and the London Poor, 1861-62, the journalist Henry Mayhew created a portrait of working London by collecting scores of interviews with workers. Novels portraying the painful consequences of industrialism, such as Elise Abbott Gaskell's Mary Barton, 1848, and North and South, 1855, and Charles Dickens's Hard Times, 1854, began to appear. The terrible living and working conditions of industrial laborers led a number of writers to see the Industrial Revolution as an appalling retrogression. Thomas Carlyle and John Buskin both lamented the changed conditions of labor, the loss of craftsmanship and individual creativity, and the disappearance of what Karl Marx called the feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations between employer and employee that they believed had existed in earlier economies. They criticized industrial manufacture not only for the misery of the conditions it created but also for its regimentation of minds and hearts as well as bodies and resources. In works such as Past and Present, 1843, and unto this last, 1660, Carlyle and Ruskin advocated a nostalgic and conservative ideal, in which employers and workers returned to a medieval relationship to craft and to authority and responsibility. Other writers drew more radical conclusions. William Morris's perception of the workers' plight led him to socialism, though a socialism with a medieval ideal, and Marx, in collaboration with Engels, based the Communist Manifesto of 1848 in part on Engels' observation of Manchester in the condition of the working class. The outrage expressed by these authors is very different from the satisfaction evident in the writings of the historian Thomas Babington Macaulay, who congratulated England on the progress that industrialism had enabled. It is instructive to compare the selections in this section with Carlyle's chapter Captains of Industry from Past and Present, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem about child labor, The Cry of the Children, 1843, Ruskin's arguments about man. Manufacture in the Stones of Bams, 1851-53, and William Morris's explanation in How I Became a Socialist, 1894. Thomas Babington Macaulay. In a book titled Colloquies on the Progress and Prospects of Society, 1829, the poet Robert Southey, 1774-1843, had sought to expose the evils of industrialism and to assert the superiority of the traditional feudal and agricultural way of life of England's past. His romantic conservatism provoked Macaulay, 1859, to review the book in a long and characteristic essay, published in the Edinburgh Review, 1830. As in his popular History of England, 1849-61, Macaulay seeks here to demolish his opponent with a bombardment of facts and figures, demonstrating that industrialism and middle-class government have resulted in progress and increased comforts for humankind. From a review of Southey's Colloquies. Evidence of progress. Perhaps we could not select a better instance of the spirit which pervades the whole book than the passages in which Mr. Southey gives his opinion of the manufacturing system. There is nothing which he hates so bitterly. It is, according to him, a system more tyrannical than that of the feudal ages, a system of actual servitude, a system which destroys the bodies and degrades the minds of those who are engaged in it. He expresses a hope that the competition of other nations may drive us out of the field, that our foreign trade may decline, and that we may thus enjoy a restoration of national sanity and strength. But he seems to think that the extermination of the whole manufacturing population would be a blessing, if the evil could be removed in no other way. Mr. Southey does not bring forward a single fact in support of these views, and, as it seems to us, there are facts which lead to a very different conclusion. In the first place, the poor rate is very decidedly lower in the manufacturing than in the agricultural districts. If Mr. Southey will look over the parliamentary returns on this subject, he will find that the amount of parochial relief required by the laborers in the different counties of England is almost exactly in inverse proportion to the degree in which the manufacturing system has been introduced into those counties. The returns for the years ending in March, 1825, and in March, 1828, are now before us. In the former year we find the poor rate highest in Sussex, about 20 shillings to every inhabitant. Then come Buckinghamshire, Essex, Suffolk, Bedfordshire, Huntingdonshire, Kent, and Norfolk. In all these the rate is above 15 shillings a head. We will not go through the whole. Even in Westmoreland and the North Riding of Yorkshire, the rate is at more than 8 shillings. In Cumberland and Monmouthshire, the most fortunate of all the agricultural districts, it is at 6 shillings. But in the West Riding of Yorkshire, it is as low as 5 shillings, and when we come to Lancashire, we find it at 4 shillings, 1/5 of what it is in Sussex. The returns of the year ending in March, 1828, are a little, and but a little, more unfavorable to the manufacturing districts. Lancashire, even in that season of distress, required a smaller poor rate than any other district, and little more than 1/4 of the poor rate raised in Sussex. Cumberland alone, of the agricultural districts, was as well off as the West Riding of Yorkshire. These facts seem to indicate that the manufacturer is both in a more comfortable and in a less dependent situation than the agricultural laborer. As to the effect of the manufacturing system on the bodily health, we must beg leave to estimate it by a standard far too low and vulgar for a mind so imaginative as that of Mr. Southey, the proportion of births and deaths. We know that, during the growth of this atrocious system, this new misery, to use the phrases of Mr. Southey, this new enormity, this birth of a portentous age, this pest which no man can approve whose heart is not seared or whose understanding has not been darkened, there has been a great diminution of mortality, and that this diminution has been greater in the manufacturing towns than anywhere else. The mortality still is, as it always was, greater in towns than in the country. But the difference has diminished in an extraordinary degree. There is the best reason to believe that the annual mortality of Manchester, about the middle of the last century, was 1 in 28. It is now reckoned at 1 in 45. In Glasgow and Leeds a similar improvement has taken place. Nay, the rate of mortality in those three great capitals of the manufacturing districts is now considerably less than it was, 50 years ago, over England and Wales, taken together, open country and all. We might, with some plausibility, maintain that the people live longer because they are better fed, better lodged, better clothed, and better attended in sickness, and that these improvements are owing to that increase of national wealth which the manufacturing system has produced. Much more might be said on this subject. But to what end? It is not from bills of mortality and statistical tables that Mr. Southey has learned his political creed. He cannot stoop to study the history of the system which he abuses, to strike the balance between the good and evil which it has produced, to compare district with district, or generation with generation. We will give his own reason for his opinion, the only reason which he gives for it, in his own words. We remained a while in silence looking upon the assemblage of dwellings below. Here, and in the adjoining hamlet of Milbeck, the effects of manufacture and of agriculture may be seen and compared. The old cottages are such as the poet and the painter equally delight in beholding. Substantially built of the native stone without mortar, dirted with no white lime, and their long low roofs covered with slate, if they had been raised by the magic of some indigenous Amphion's music, the materials could not have adjusted themselves more beautifully in accord with the surrounding scene, and time has still further harmonized them with weather stains, lichens, and moss, short grasses, and short fern, and stone plants of various kinds. The ornamented chimneys, round or square, less adorned than those which, like little turrets, crest the houses of the Portuguese peasantry, and yet not less happily suited to their place. The hedge of clipped box beneath the windows, the rose bushes beside the door, the little patch of flower ground, with its tall hollyhocks in front, the garden beside, the beehives, and the orchard with its bank of daffodils and snowdrops, the earliest and the profusest in these parts, indicate in the owner some portion of ease and leisure, some regard to neatness and comfort, some sense of natural and innocent and healthful enjoyment. The new cottages of the manufacturers are upon the manufacturing path turned naked, and in a row. How is it, said I, that everything which is connected with manufactures presents such features of unqualified deformity? From the largest of Mammon's temples down to the poorest hovel in which his helotry registered are stalled, these edifices have all one character. Time will not mellow them, nature will neither clothe nor conceal them, and they will remain always as offensive to the eye as to the mind. Here is wisdom. Here are the principles on which nations are to be governed. Rosebushes and poor rates, rather than steam engines and impotence. Mortality and cottages with weather stains, rather than health and long life with edifices which time cannot mellow. We are told that our age has invented atrocities beyond the imagination of our fathers, that society has been brought into a state compared with which extermination would be a blessing, and all because the dwellings of cotton spinners are naked and rectangular. Mr. Southey has found out a way, he tells us, in which the effects of manufactures and agriculture may be compared. And what is this way? To stand on a hill, to look at a cottage and a factory, and to see which is the prettier. Does Mr. Southey think that the body of the English peasantry live, or ever lived, in substantial or ornamented cottages, with box hedges, flower gardens, bee hives, and orchards? If not, what is his parallel worth? We despise those mock philosophers, who think that they serve the cause of science by depreciating literature and the fine arts. But if anything could excuse their narrowness of mind, it would be such a book as this. It is not strange that, when one enthusiast makes the picturesque the test of political good, another should feel inclined to proscribe altogether the pleasures of taste and imagination. It was not strange that, differing so widely from Mr. Southey as to the past progress of society, we should differ from him also as to its probable destiny. He thinks, that to all outward appearance, the country is hastening to destruction, but he relies firmly on the goodness of God. We do not see either the piety or the rationality of thus confidently expecting that the Supreme Being will interfere to disturb the common succession of causes and effects. We, too, rely on his goodness as manifested, not in extraordinary interpositions, but in those general laws which it has pleased him to establish in the physical and in the moral world. We rely on the natural tendency of the human intellect to truth, and on the natural tendency of society to improvement. We know no well-authenticated instance of a people which has decidedly retrograde in civilization and prosperity, except from the influence of violent and terrible calamities, such as those which laid the Roman Empire in ruins, or those which, about the beginning of the 16th century, desolate Italy registered. We know of no country which, at the end of 50 years of peace and tolerably good government, has been less prosperous than at the beginning of that period. The political importance of a state may decline, as the balance of power is disturbed by the introduction of new forces. Thus the influence of Holland and of Spain is much diminished. But are Holland and Spain poorer than formerly? We doubt it. Other countries have outrun them. But we suspect that they have been positively, though not relatively, advancing. We suspect that Holland is richer than when she sent her navies up the Thames. That Spain is richer than when a French king was brought captive to the footstool of Charles V. History is full of the signs of this natural progress of society. We see in almost every part of the annals of mankind how the industry of individuals, struggling up against wars, taxes, famines, conflagrations, mischievous prohibitions, and more mischievous protections, creates faster than governments can squander, and repairs whatever invaders can destroy. We see the wealth of nations increasing, and all the arts of life approaching nearer and nearer to perfection, in spite of the grossest corruption and the wildest profusion on the part of rulers. The present moment is one of great distress. But how small will that distress appear when we think over the history of the last 40 years, a war, compared with which all other wars sink into insignificance, taxation, such as the most heavily taxed people of former times could not have conceived, a debt larger than all the public debts that ever existed in the world added together, the food of the people studiously rendered dear, registered the currency imprudently debased, and imprudently restored. Yet is the country poorer than in 1790? We firmly believe that, in spite of all the misgovernment of her rulers, she has been almost constantly becoming richer and richer. Now and then there has been a stoppage, now and then a short retrogression, but as to the general tendency there can be no doubt. A single breaker may recede, but the tide is evidently coming in. If we were to prophesy that in the year 1930 a population of 50 millions, better fed, clad, and lodged than the English of our time, will cover these islands, that Sussex and Huntingdonshire will be wealthier than the wealthiest parts of the West Riding of Yorkshire now are, that cultivation, rich as that of a flower garden, will be carried up to the very tops of Wren Nevis and Helvellyn *, that machines constructed on principles yet undiscovered will be in every house, that there will be no highways but railroads, no traveling but by steam. That our debt, vast as it seems to us, will appear to our great-grandchildren a trifling encumbrance, which might easily be paid off in a year or two. Many people would think us insane. We prophesy nothing, but this we say, if any person had told the Parliament which met in perplexity and terror after the crash Indiana 17205 that in 1830 the wealth of England would surpass all their wildest dreams, that the annual revenue would equal the principal of that debt which they considered as an intolerable burden, that for one man of £10,000 then living there would be 5 men of £50,000, that London would be twice as large and twice as populous, and that nevertheless the rate of mortality would have diminished to 1/2 of what it then was, that the post office would bring more into the exchequer than the excise and customs had brought in together under Charles II, that stage coaches would run from London to York in 24 hours, that men would be in the habit of sailing without wind, and would be beginning to ride without horses. Our ancestors would have given as much credit to the prediction as they gave to Gulliver's Travels registered, yet the prediction would have been true, and they would have perceived that it was not altogether absurd, if they had considered that the country was then raising every year a sum which would have purchased the fee simple of the revenue of the Plantagenets, 10 times what supported the government of Elizabeth, 3 times what, in the time of Cromwell registered had been thought intolerably oppressive. To almost all men the state of things under which they have been used to live seems to be the necessary state of things. We have heard it said that 5% is the natural interest of money, that 12 is the natural number of a jury, that 40 shillings is the natural qualification of a county voter. Hence it is that, though in every age everybody knows that up to his own time progressive improvement has been taking place, nobody seems to reckon on any improvement during the next generation. We cannot absolutely prove that those are in error who tell us that society has reached a turning point, that we have seen our best days. But so said all who came before us, and with just as much apparent reason. "A million a year will beggar us," said the patriots of 1640. 2 millions a year will grind the country to powder, was the cry in 1660. 6 millions a year, and a debt of 50 millions, exclaimed Swift, the high allies have been the ruin of us. 140 millions of debt, said Junius, registered. Well may we say that we owe Lord Chatham more than we shall ever pay, if we owe him such a load as this. 240 millions of debt, cried all the statesmen of 1783 in chorus. What abilities, or what economy on the part of a minister, can save a country so burdened? We know that if, since 1783, no fresh debt had been incurred, the increased resources of the country would have enabled us to defray that debt at which Pitt, Fox, and Burke stood aghast, nay, to defray it over and over again, and that with much lighter taxation than what we have actually borne. On what principle is it that, when we see nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? It is not by the intermeddling of Mr. Southey's idle, the omniscient and omnipotent state, but by the prudence and energy of the people, that England has hitherto been carried forward in civilization, and it is to the same prudence and the same energy that we now look with comfort and good hope. Our rulers will best promote the improvement of the nation by strictly confining themselves to their own legitimate duties, by leaving capital to find its most lucrative course, commodities their fair price, industry and intelligence their natural reward, idleness and folly their natural punishment, by maintaining peace, by defending property, by diminishing the price of law, and by observing strict economy in every department of the state. Let the government do this, the people will assuredly do the rest. 1830. The Children's Employment Commission. Although official attempts to regulate child labor began in 1788, when Parliament passed the Chimney Sweepers Act, the more general problem was not addressed until well into the 19th century. Government investigations, select committees and royal commissions, took place in 1816 and the early 1830s and led to numerous legislative measures, but most of their provisions were meaningless because they were not enforced. The Factories Regulation Act of 1833 marks the first significant point of successful intervention. The act both established a minimum age for all workers in textile mills, 9 years old, and set limits to the hours that children in different age groups and women could work in a week. More broadly, a royal commission was convened in 1842-43 to examine the mines and collieries of the United Kingdom and all trades and manufactures whatever in which children work together in number. Bears. The reports of the commission, from which this extract and 2 illustrations are taken, caused dismay and disbelief when they were made generally available. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem The Cry of the Children, 1843, was one of the many public responses to the scandal. In the legislation that followed, girls and women were banned from mine work, although the authors of the BDL had also hoped to prohibit the employment of boys under 13 years of age. Parliamentary debate knocked the age down to 10. The first illustration shows a hurrier, a worker who dragged a loaded corve, or wagon. These weighed between 200 and 500 pounds and were attached to the hurrier by a chain. The passageways in the mine, or pit, were sometimes only 16 inches high. The second illustration presents a thruster, who pushed a cone. The child on the left one's a trapper, the youngest workers of all. These 5 or 6-year-olds sat alone in darkness to open and close the doors that controlled the mine's ventilation system. The extract comes from the evidence collected by Commissioner 5. S. Scriven, who visited the mines in the West Riding of Yorkshire in the company of a local doctor and lawyer, and interviewed the child laborers there. From first report of the Commissioners, Mines. Child mine worker in Yorkshire. Margaret Gimley, living at Lindley Moor, aged 9. May 7th. They call me Peggy for my nickname down here, but my right name is Margaret. I am about 9 years, or going 9. I have been at work in the pit thrusting cords above a year, come in the morning sometimes at 7 o'clock, sometimes 7:30, and I go sometimes home at 6 o'clock, sometimes at 7 when I do overwork. I get my breakfast of porridge before I come, and bring a piece of muffin, which I eat on coming to pit. I get my dinner at 12 o'clock, which is a dry muffin, and sometimes butter on, but have no time allowed to stop to eat it. I eat it while I am thrusting the load. I get no tea, but get some supper when I get home, and then go to bed when I have washed me, and am very tired. I worked in pit last winter. I don't know at what hour I went down, as we have no clock, but it was daylight. It was 6 o'clock when we came up, but not always. They flog us down in the pit, sometimes with their hand upon my bottom, which hurts me very much. Thomas Copeland flogs me more than once in a day, which makes me cry. There are 2 other girls working with me, and there was 4, but one left because she had the bellyache. I am poorly myself sometimes with bellyache, and sometimes headache. I had rather late than go into the pit. I get 5d. 8a, but I had rather set cards. 4 5d. 8a than go into the pit. The men often swear at me, many times they say damn thee, and other times God damn thee, and such like. Peggy. Commissioner Scriven's commentary. Descended this pit accompanied by one of the banksmen, and, on alighting at the bottom, found the entrance to the mainway 2 feet 10 inches, and, which extended 500 yards. The bottom was deep in mire, and, as I had no cords low enough to convey me to the workings, waited some time under the dripping shaft the arrival of the hurriers, as I had reason to suspect there were some very young children lobbering there. At length 3 girls arrived, with as many boys. It was impossible in the dark to distinguish the sexes. They were all naked excepting their shifts or shirts. Having placed one into the corve, I gave the signal, and ascended. On alighting on the pit's bank I discovered that it was a girl. I could not have believed that I should have found human nature so degraded. There is nothing that I can conceive amidst all the misery and wretchedness in the worst of factories equal to this. Mr. Holrove, solicitor, and Mr. Brooke, surgeon, practicing in Stainland, were present, who confessed that, although living within a few miles, they could not have believed that such a system of unchristian cruelty could have existed. 1842-43. Friedrich Engels. These eyewitness accounts from the condition of the working class, 1845, describe conditions of 1844, when Engels, 1820-1895, the son of a successful German industrialist, had been living in England, chiefly in Manchester. The book was first translated from the German into English in 1892, this translation is by W. O. Henderson and W. H. Chaloner, 1958. The first 2 paragraphs are the conclusion of Chapter 2, the industrial proletariat, the balance is from Chapter 3. From the great towns. Industry and commerce attain their highest stage of development in the big towns, so that it is here that the effects of industrialization on the wage earners can be most clearly seen. It is in these big towns that the concentration of property has reached its highest point. Here the manners and customs of the good old days have been most effectively destroyed. Here the very name of Merry England has long since been forgotten, because the inhabitants of the great manufacturing centers have never even heard from their grandparents what life was like in those days. In these towns there are only rich and poor, because the lower middle classes are fast disappearing. At one time this section of the middle classes was the most stable social group, but now it has become the least stable. It is represented in the big factory towns today partly by a few survivors from a bygone age and partly by a group of people who are anxious to get rich as quickly as possible. Of these shady speculators and dubious traders one becomes rich while 99 go bankrupt. Indeed, for more than half of those who have failed, bankruptcy has become a habit. The vast majority of the inhabitants of these towns are the workers. We propose to discuss their condition and to discover how they have been influenced by life and work in the great factory towns. London is unique, because it is a city in which one can roam for hours without leaving the built-up area and without seeing the slightest sign of the approach of open country. This enormous agglomeration of population on a single spot has multiplied 100-fold the economic strength of the 2.5 million inhabitants concentrated there. This great population has made London the commercial capital of the world and has created the gigantic docks in which are assembled the thousands of ships which always cover the River Thames. I know nothing more imposing than the view one obtains of the river when sailing from the sea up to London Bridge. Especially above Woolwich the houses and docks are packed tightly together on both banks of the river. The further one goes up the river the thicker becomes the concentration of ships lying at anchor, so that eventually only a narrow shipping lane is left free in midstream. Here hundreds of steamships start rapidly to and fro. All this is so magnificent and impressive that one is lost in admiration. The traveler has good reason to marvel at England's greatness even before he steps on English soil. It is only later that the traveler appreciates the human suffering which has made all this possible. He can only realize the price that has been paid for all this magnificence after he has tramped the pavements of the main streets of London for some days and has tired himself out by jostling his way through the crowds and dodging the endless stream of coaches and carts which fills the streets. It is only when he has visited the slums of this great city that it dawns upon him that the inhabitants of modern London have had to sacrifice so much that is best in human nature in order to create those wonders of civilization with which their city teems. The vast majority of Londoners have had to let so many of their potential creative faculties lie dormant, stunted and unused in order that a small, closely knit group of their fellow citizens could develop to the full the qualities with which nature has endowed them. The restless and noisy activity of the crowded streets is highly distasteful, and it is surely abhorrent to human nature itself. Hundreds of thousands of men and women drawn from all classes and ranks of society pack the streets of London. Are they not all human beings with the same innate characteristics and potentialities? Are they not all equally interested in the pursuit of happiness? And do they not all aim at happiness by following similar methods? Yet they rush past each other as if they had nothing in common. They are tacitly agreed on one thing only, that everyone should keep to the right of the pave, meant so as not to collide with the stream of people moving in the opposite direction. No one even thinks of sparing a glance for his neighbor in the streets. The more that Londoners are packed into a tiny space, the more repulsive and disgraceful becomes the brutal indifference with which they ignore their neighbors and selfishly concentrate upon their private affairs. We know well enough that this isolation of the individual, this narrow-minded egotism, is everywhere the fundamental principle of modern society. But nowhere is the selfish egotism so blatantly evident as in the frantic bustle of the great city. The disintegration of society into individuals, each guided by his private principles and each pursuing his own aims, has been pushed to its furthest limits in London. Here indeed human society has been split into its component atoms. From this it follows that the social conflict, the war of all against all, is fought in the open. Here men regard their fellows not as human beings, but as pawns in the struggle for existence. Everyone exploits his neighbor with the result that the stronger tramples the weaker underfoot. The strongest of all, a tiny group of capitalists, monopolize everything, while the weakest, who are in the vast majority, succumb to the most abject poverty. What is true of London is true also of all the great towns, such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds. Everywhere one finds on the one hand the most barbarous indifference and selfish egotism, and on the other the most distressing scenes of misery and poverty. Signs of social conflict are to be found everywhere. Everyone turns his house into a fortress to defend himself under the protection of the law from the depredations of his neighbors. Class warfare is so open and shameless that it has to be seen to be believed. The observer of such an appalling state of affairs must shudder at the consequences of such feverish activity, and can only marvel that so crazy a social and economic stroke should survive at all. Every great town has one or more slum areas into which the working classes are packed. Sometimes, of course, poverty is to be found hidden away in alleys close to the stately homes of the wealthy. Generally, however, the workers are segregated in separate districts where they struggle through life as best they can out of sight of the more fortunate classes of society. The slums of the English towns have much in common, the worst houses in a town being found in the worst districts. They are generally unplanned wildernesses of 1 or 2-storied terrace houses built of brick. Wherever possible these have cellars which are also used as dwellings. These little houses of 3 or 4 rooms and a kitchen are called cottages, and throughout England, except for some parts of London, are where the working classes normally live. These streets themselves are usually unpaved and full of holes. They are filthy and strewn with animal and vegetable refuse. Since they have neither gutters nor drains, the refuse accumulates in stagnant, stinking puddles. Ventilation in the slums is inadequate owing to the hopelessly unplanned nature of these areas. A great many people live huddled together in a very small area, and so it is easy to imagine the nature of the air in these workers' quarters. However, in fine weather the streets are used for the drying of washing, and clotheslines are stretched across the streets from house to house, and wet garments are hung out on them. We propose to describe some of these slums in detail. If we cross Blackstone Edge on foot or take the train, we reach Manchester, the regional capital of South Lancashire, and enter the classic home of English industry. This is the masterpiece of the Industrial Revolution and at the same time the mainspring of all the workers' movements. Once more we are in a beautiful hilly countryside. The land slopes gently down toward the Irish Sea, intersected by the charming green valleys of the Ribble, the Irwell, the Mersey, and their tributaries. 100 years ago this region was to a great extent thinly populated marshland. Now it is covered with towns and villages and is the most densely populated part of England. In Lancashire, particularly in Manchester, is to be found not only the origin but the heart of the industry of the United Kingdom. Manchester Exchange is the thermometer which records all the fluctuations of industrial and commercial activity. The evolution of the modern system of manufacture has reached its climax in Manchester. It was in the South Lancashire cotton industry that water and steam power first replaced hand machines. It was here that such machines as the power loom and the self-acting mule replaced the old hand loom and spinning wheel. It is here that the division of labor has been pushed to its furthest limits. These 3 factors are the essence of modern industry. In all 3 of them the cotton industry was the pioneer and remains ahead in all branches of industry. In the circumstances it is to be expected that it is in this region that the inevitable consequences of industrialization insofar as they affect the working classes are most strikingly evident. Nowhere else can the life and conditions of the industrial proletariat be studied in all their aspects as in South Lancashire. Here can be seen most clearly the degradation into which the worker sinks owing to the introduction of steam power, machinery, and the division of labor. Here, too, can be seen most the strenuous efforts of the proletariat to raise themselves from their degraded situation. I propose to examine conditions in Manchester in greater detail for 2 reasons. In the first place, Manchester is the classic type of modern industrial town. Secondly, I know Manchester as well as I know my native town, and I know more about it than most of its inhabitants. Owing to the curious law out of the town, it is quite possible for someone to live for years in Manchester and to travel daily to and from his work, without ever seeing a working class quarter or coming into contact with an artisan. He who visits Manchester simply on business or for pleasure need never see the slums, mainly because the working class districts and the middle class districts are quite distinct. This division is due partly to deliberate policy and partly to instinctive and tacit agreement between the 2 social groups. In those areas where the 2 social groups happen to come into contact with each other, the middle classes sanctimoniously ignore the existence of their less fortunate neighbors. In the center of Manchester there runs a fairly large commercial district, which is about half a mile long and half a mile broad. This district is almost entirely given over to offices and warehouses. Nearly the whole of this district has no permanent residents, and I once deserted at night, when only policemen patrol its dark, narrow thoroughfares with their bulls. Eye lanterns registered this district once intersected by certain main streets which carry an enormous volume of traffic. The lower floors of the buildings are occupied by shops of dazzling splendor. A few of the upper stories on these premises are used as dwellings, and the streets present a relatively busy appearance until late in the evening. Around this commercial quarter there is a belt of built-up areas on the average 1.5 miles in width, which is occupied entirely by working-class dwellings. This area of workers' houses includes all Manchester proper, except the centre, all Salford and Hume, an important part of Pendleton and Chorlton, 2/3 of Ardwick, and certain small areas of Cheetham Hill and Broughton. Beyond this belt of working-class houses or dwellings lie the districts inhabited by the middle classes and the upper classes. The former are to be found in regularly laid out streets near the working-class districts in Chorlton and in the remoter parts of Cheetham Hill. The villas of the upper classes are surrounded by gardens and lie in the higher end remoter parts of Chorlton and Ardwick, or on the breezy heights of Cheetham Hill, Broughton, and Pendleton. The upper class enjoy healthy country air and live in luxurious and comfortable dwellings which are linked to the centre of Manchester by omnibuses which run every 15 or 30 minutes. To such an extent has the convenience of the rich been considered in the planning of Manchester that these plutocrats can travel from their houses to their places of business in the centre of the town by the shortest routes, which run entirely through working-class districts, without even realizing how close they are to the misery and filth which lie on both sides of the road. We'll now give a description of the working-class districts of Manchester. The first of them is the Old Town, which lies between the northern limit of the commercial quarter and the River Irk. Here even the better streets, such Todd Street, Longmill Gate, Wadi Grove, and Shooty Hill are narrow and tortuous. The houses are dirty, old, and tumble down. The side streets have been built in a disgraceful fashion. If one enters the district near the old church and goes down Longmill Gate, one sees immediately on the right-hand side a row of antiquated houses where not a single front wall is standing upright. This is a remnant of the old Manchester of the days before the town became industrialized. The original inhabitants and their children have left for better houses in other districts, while the houses in Longmill Gate, which no longer satisfied them, were left to a tribe of workers containing a strong Irish element. Here one is really and truly in a district which is quite obviously given over entirely to the working classes, because even the shopkeepers and the publicans of Longmill Gate make no effort to give their establishments a semblance of cleanliness. The condition of the street may be deplorable, but it is by no means as bad as the alleys and courts which lie behind it, and which can be approached only by covered passages so narrow that two people cannot pass. Anyone who has never visited these courts and alleys can have no idea of the fantastic asterisk way in which the houses have been packed together in disorderly confusion and impudent defiance of all reasonable principles of town planning. And the fault lies not merely in the survival of old property from earlier periods in Manchester's history. Only in quite modern times has the policy of cramming as many houses as possible onto such space as was not utilized in earlier periods reached its climax. The result is that today not an inch of space remains between the houses and any further building is now physically impossible. To prove my point, I reproduce a small section of a plan of Manchester. It is by no means the worst slum in Manchester, and it does not cover 1/10 of the area of Manchester. This sketch will be sufficient to illustrate the crazy layout of the whole district lying near the River Irk. There is a very sharp drop of some 15 to 30 feet down to the south bank of the Irk at this point. As many as 3 rows of houses have generally been squeezed onto this precipitous slope. The lowest row of houses stands directly on the bank of the river, while the front walls of the highest row stand on the crest of the ridge in Longmill Gate. Moreover, factory buildings are also to be found on the banks of the river. In short, the layout of the upper part of Longmill Gate at the top of the rise is just as disorderly and congested as the lower part of the street. To the right and left, a number of covered passages from Longmill Gate give access to several courts. On reaching them one meets with a degree of dirt and revolting filth the like of which is not to be found elsewhere. The worst courts are those leading down to the Irk, which contain unquestionably the most dreadful dwellings I have ever seen. In one of these courts, just at the entrance where the covered passage ends, there is a privy without a door. This privy is so dirty that the inhabitants of the court can only enter or leave the court if they are prepared to wade through puddles of stale urine and excrement. Anyone who wishes to confirm this description should go to the first court on the bank of the Irk above Ducie Bridge. Several tanneries are situated on the bank of the river and they fill the neighborhood with the stench of animal putrefaction. The only way of getting to the courts below Ducie Bridge is by going down flights of narrow dirty steps, and one can only reach the houses by treading over heaps of dirt and filth. The first court below Ducie Bridge is called Allen's Court. At the time of the cholera 1832 this court was in such a disgraceful state that the sanitary inspectors of the local board of health evacuated the inhabitants. The court was then swept and fumigated with chlorine. In his pamphlet registered, Dr. K gives a horrifying description of conditions in this court at that time. Since K wrote this pamphlet, this court appears to have been at any rate partly demolished and rebuilt. If one looks down the river from Ducie Bridge, one does at least see several ruined walls and high piles of rubble, side by side with some recently built houses. The view from this bridge, which is mercifully concealed by a high parapet from all but the tallest mortals, is quite characteristic of the whole district. At the bottom the Irk flows, or rather, stagnates. It is a narrow, coal-black, stinking river full of filth and rubbish which it deposits on the more low-lying right bank. In dry weather this bank presents the spectacle of a series of the most revolting blackish-green puddles of slime, from the depths of which bubbles of miasmatic gases constantly rise and create a stench which is unbearable even to those standing on the bridge 40 or 50 feet above the level of the water. Moreover, the flow of the river is continually interrupted by numerous high weirs, behind which large quantities of slime and refuse collect and putrefy. Above Ducie Bridge there are some tall tannery buildings, and further up there are dye works, bone mills, and gas works. All the filth, both liquid and solid, discharged by these works finds its way into the River Irk, which also receives the contents of the adjacent sewers and privies. The nature of the filth deposited by this river may well be imagined. If one looks at the heaps of garbage below Ducie Bridge, one can gauge the extent to which accumulated dirt, filth, and decay permeate the courts on the steep left bank of the river. The houses are packed very closely together, and since the bank of the river is very steep it is possible to see a part of every house. All of them have been blackened by soot, all of them are crumbling with age, and all have broken window panes and window frames. In the background there are old factory buildings which look like barracks. On the opposite, low-lying bank of the river, one sees a long row of houses and factories. The second house is a roofless ruin, filled with refuse, and the third is built in such a low situation that the ground floor is uninhabitable and has neither doors nor windows. In the background one sees the pauper cemetery, and the stations of the railways to Liverpool and Leeds. Behind these buildings is situated the workhouse, Manchester's Poor Law Bastille. The workhouse is built on a hill, and from behind its high walls and battlements seems to threaten the whole adjacent working class quarter like a fortress. Above Ducie Bridge the left bank of the Irk becomes flatter and the right bank of the Irk becomes steeper, and so the condition of the houses on both sides of the river becomes worse rather than better. Turning left from the main street, which is still Longmill Gate, the visitor can easily lose his way. He wanders aimlessly from one court to another. He turns one corner after another through innumerable narrow dirty alleyways and passages, and in only a few minutes he has lost all sense of direction and does not know which way to turn. The area is full of ruined or half-ruined buildings. Some of them are actually uninhabited, and that means a great deal in this quarter of the town. In the houses one seldom sees a wooden or a stone floor, while the doors and windows are nearly always broken and badly fitting. And as for the dirt, everywhere one sees heaps of refuse, garbage, and filth. There are stagnant pools instead of gutters, and the stench alone is so overpowering that no human being, even partially civilized, would find it bearable to live in such a district registered. The recently constructed extension of the Leeds Railway, which crosses the Irk at this point, has swept away some of these courts and alleys, but it has thrown open to public gaze some of the others. So it comes about that there is to be found immediately under the railway bridge a court which is even filthier and more revolting than all the others. This is simply because it was formerly so hidden and secluded that it could only be reached with considerable difficulty, but is now exposed to the human eye. I thought I knew this district well, but even I would never have found it had not the railway viaduct made a breach in the slums at this point. One walks along a very rough path on the river bank, in between clothes posts and washing lines, to reach a chaotic group of little, one-storied, one-room cabins. Most of them have earth floors, and working, living, and sleeping all take place in the one room. In such a hole, Barely 6 feet long and 5 feet wide, I saw 2 beds and what beds and bedding, which filled the room, except for the fireplace and the doorstep. Several of these huts, as far as I could see, were completely empty, although the door was open and the inhabitants were leaning against the doorposts. In front of the doors filth and garbage abounded. I could not see the pavement, but from time to time, I felt it was there because my feet scraped it. This whole collection of cattle sheds for human beings was surrounded on 2 sides by houses and a factory and on a 3rd side by the river. It was possible to get to the slum by only 2 routes. One was the narrow path along the river bank, while the other was a narrow gateway which led to another human rabbit warren which was nearly as badly built and was nearly in such a bad condition as the one I have just described. Enough of this. All along the slums of this type abound. There is an unplanned and chaotic conglomeration of houses, most of which are more or less unhabitable. The dirtiness of the interiors of these premises is fully in keeping with the filth that surrounds them. How can people dwelling in such places keep clean? There are not even adequate facilities for satisfying the most natural daily needs. There are so few privies that they are either filled up every day or are too far away for those who need to use them. How can these people wash when all that is available is the dirty water of the earth? Pumps and piped water are to be found only in the better class districts of the town. Indeed, no one can blame these helots of modern civilization if their homes are no cleaner than the occasional pigsties which are a feature of these slums. There are actually some property owners who are not ashamed to let dwellings such as those which are to be found below Scotland Bridge. Here on the quayside a mere 6 feet from the water's edge is to be found a row of 6 or 7 cellars, the bottoms of which are at least 2 feet beneath the low water level of the earth. What can one say of the owner of the corner house situated on the opposite bank of the river above Scotland Bridge who actually lets the upper floor although the premises downstairs are quite uninhabitable and no attempt has been made to board up the gaps left by the disappearance of doors and windows? This sort of thing is by no means uncommon in this part of Manchester, where, owing to the lack of conveniences, such deserted ground floors are often used by the whole neighborhood as privies. 1845. Charles Kingsley. The following selection is from Chapter 8 of Alton Locke, a novel by Kingsley, 1819-1875. Under the influence of Thomas Carlyle's writings and also as a result of his own observations, Kingsley, a clergyman, became deeply concerned with the sufferings of the working classes. The speaker here, a young tailor, is accompanied by an elderly Scottish bookseller, Sandy McAvee. From Alton Locke. A London slum. It was a foul, chilly, foggy Saturday night. From the butchers' and greengrocers' shops the gaslights flared and flickered, wild and ghastly, over haggard groups of slipshod dirty women, bargaining for scraps of stale meat and frostbitten vegetables, wrangling about short weight and bad quality. Fish stalls and fruit stalls lined the edge of the greasy pavement, sending up odors as foul as the language of sellers and buyers. Blood and sewer water crawled from under doors and out of spouts, and reeked down the gutters among offal, animal, and vegetable, in every stage of putrefaction. Foul vapors rose from cowsheds and slaughterhouses, and the doorways of undrained alleys, where the inhabitants carried the filth out on their shoes from the backyard into the court, and from the court up into the main street, while above, hanging like cliffs over the streets those narrow, brawling torrents of filth, and poverty. And sin the houses with their teeming load of life were piled up into the dingy, choking night. A ghastly, deepening, sickening sight it was. Go, scented Belgravian, and see what London is. And then go to the library which God has given thee one often fears in vain and see what science says this London might be. We went on through a back street or two, and then into a huge, miserable house, which, 100 years ago, perhaps, had witnessed the luxury, and rung to the laughter of some one great fashionable family, alone there in their glory. Now every room of it held its family, or its group of families of philanthropy. Of all the fiends its grand staircase, with the carved balustrades rotting and crumbling away piecemeal, converted into a common sewer for all its inmates. Up stair after stair we went, while wails of children, and curses of men, steamed out upon the hot stifling rush of air from every doorway, till, at the topmost story, we knocked at a garret door. We entered. Bare it was of furniture, comfortless, and freezing cold, but, with the exception of the plaster dropping from the roof, and the broken windows, patched with rags and paper, there was a scrupulous neatness about the whole, which contrasted strangely with the filth and slovenliness outside. There was no bed in the room, no table. On a broken chair by the chimney sat a miserable old woman, fancying that she was warming her hands over embers which had long been cold, shacking her head, and muttering to herself, with palsied lips, about the guardians 3 and the workhouse, while upon a few rags on the floor lay a girl, ugly, small-pox-marked, hollow-eyed, emaciated, her only bedclothes the skirt of a large handsome new riding habit, at which 2 other girls, Wan and Tawdry, were stitching busily, as they sat right and left of her on the floor. The old woman took no notice of us as we entered, but one of the girls looked up, and, with a pleased gesture of recognition, put her finger up to her lips, and whispered, "Ellen's asleep." "I'm not asleep, dears," answered a faint unearthly voice, "I was only praying." "Is that Mr. Mackay?" "Aye, my lassies, but ha' ye gotten any fire the night?" "No," said one of them, bitterly, "we've earned no fire tonight, by fair trade or foul either." 1850. Charles Dickens. The following selection is from Chapter 5 of Hard Times, a novel by Dickens, 1812-1870. The picture of Coketown was based on his impressions of the raw industrial towns of central and northern England such as Manchester and, in particular, Preston, a cotton manufacturing centre in Lancashire. From Hard Times. Coketown. It was a town of red brick, or a brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it, but as matters stood it was a town of unnatural red and black like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of buildings full of windows where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. It contained several large streets all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. These attributes of Coketown were in the main inseparable from the work by which it was sustained. Against them were to be set off comforts of life which found their way all over the world, and elegancies of life which made, we will not ask how much of the fine lady, who could scarcely bear to hear the place mentioned. The rest of its features were voluntary, and they were these. You saw nothing in Coketown but what was severely workful. If the MEM bears of a religious persuasion built a chapel there as the members of 18 religious persuasions had done, they made it a pious warehouse of red brick, with sometimes, but this is only in highly ornamented examples, a bell in a birdcage on the top of it. The solitary exception was the new church, a stuccoed edifice with a square steeple over the door terminating in 4 short pinnacles like florid wooden legs. All the public inscriptions in the town were painted alike, in severe characters of black and white. The jail might have been the infirmary might have been the jail, the town hall might have been either, or both, or anything else, for anything that appeared to the contrary in the graces of their construction. Fact, 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 everywhere in the material aspect of the town, fact, 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 everywhere in the immaterial. The M. Cockham Child School was all fact, and the School of Design was all fact, and the relations between master and man were all fact, and everything was fact between the lying-in hospital and the cemetery, and what you couldn't state in figures, or show to be purchasable in the cheapest market and saleable in the dearest, was not, and never should be, world without end. Amen. 1854. Anonymous. In 1965 A. L. Lloyd, a collector of British folk songs, heard Poverty Knock from a weaver who had learned it 60 years earlier. The song dates from before that. Poverty knock. Refrain. Poverty, poverty knock. Me loom is a sane all day. Poverty, poverty knock. Gaffer's too skinny to pay. The foreman / stingy. Poverty, poverty knock. Keepin' one eye on the clock. I know I can guddle. When I'll hear me shuttle go, poverty, poverty knock. Up every morning at 5. I wonder that we keep alive. Tired and yawning on the cold morning, it's back to the dreary old drive. Oh dear, we're going to be late. Gatter is stood at the gate. We're out o' pocket, our wages their docket. Willa to buy grub on the slate. And what our wages they'll bring, we're often short of a string. While we are fratchin' W.I. Gaffer for snatchin'. We know to his brass. He will cling. We've got to wet our own yarn by dippin' it into the tarn. It's wet and soggy and makes us feel groggy, and there's mice in that dirty old barn. Oh dear, me poor EAD it sings. I should have woven 3 strings, but threads are breaking and my back is atchin'. Oh dear, I wish I had wings. Sometimes a shuttle flies out, gives some poor woman a clout. There she lies bleedin', but nobody's eatin'. Woes go and carry her out. Tuner registered should tackle me loom. Ed rather sit on his bum. He's far too busy a courtin' our Lizzie, and I can't get I'm to come. Lizzie is so easy led. I think that he takes her to bed. She alias was skinny, now look at her pinny. It's just about time they was wed. Henry Mayhew. In 1849 Mayhew, 1812 to 1887, was asked by the Morning Chronicle to be the Metropolitan correspondent for its series Labor and the Poor. His interviews of work ERS and of street folk, later published as a book, convey a vivid sense of the lives of London's poor. From London Labor and the London Poor. Boy inmate of the casual wards 1. I am now 17. My father was a cotton spinner in Manchester, but has been dead 10 years, and soon after that my mother went into the workhouse, leaving me with an aunt, and I had to work in a cotton factory. As young as I was, I earned 2d2 a week at first. I can read well, and write a little. I worked at the factory 2 years, and was then earning 7s a week. I then ran away, for I had always a roving mind, but I should have stayed if my master hadn't knocked me about so. I thought I should make my fortune in London. I'd heard it was such a grand place. I had read in novels and romances halfpenny and penny books about such things, but I've met with nothing of the kind. I started without money, and begged my way from Manchester to London, saying I was going up to look for work. I wanted to see the place more than anything else. I suffered very much on the road, having to be out all night often, and the nights were cold, though it was summer. When I got to London all my hopes were blighted. I could get no further. I never tried for work in London, for I believe there are no cotton factories in it. Besides, I wanted to see life. I begged, and slept in the Unions. Point 3 I got acquainted with plenty of boys like myself. We met at the casual wards, both in London and the country. I have now been 5 years at this life. We were merry enough in the wards, we boys, singing and telling stories. I live a roving life, at first, being my own master. I was fond of going to plays, and such like, when I got money, but now I'm getting tired of it, and wish for something else. I have tried for work at cotton factories in Lancashire and Yorkshire, but never could get any. I'm sure I could settle now. I couldn't have done that 2 years ago, the roving spirit was so strong upon me and the company I kept got a strong hold on me. 2 winters back, there was a regular gang of us boys in London. After sleeping at a union, we would fix where to meet at night to get into another union to sleep. There were 30 of us that way, all boys, besides 40 young men, and 30 young women. Sometimes we walked the streets all night. We didn't rob, at least I never saw any robbing. We had pleasure in chaffing for the policeman, and some of us got taken up. I always escaped. We got broken up in time, some's dead, some's gone to sea. Some into the country, some home, and some lagged. Point 5 among them were many young lads very expert in reading, writing, and arithmetic. One young man, he was only 25, could speak several languages. He had been to sea. He was then begging, though a strong young man. I suppose he liked that life. Some soon got tired of it. I often have suffered from cold and hunger. I never made more than 3d a day in money, take the year round, by begging. Some make more than 6d. But then, I've had meat and bread given besides. I say nothing when I beg, but that I am a poor boy out of work and starving. I never stole anything in my life. I've often been asked to do so by my mates. I never would. The young women steal the most. I know, least, I did know, 2 that kept young men, their partners, going about the country with them, chiefly by their stealing. Some do so by their prostitution. Those go as partners are all prostitutes. There is a great deal of sickness among the young men and women, but I never was ill these last 7 years. Fevers, colds, and venereal diseases are very common. 1851. Annie Besant. In 1873 Besant, 1847-1933, left the church and her marriage to an Anglican clergyman to become active in feminist and socialist causes. When she heard about the high dividends and low wages at the match factory of Bryant and May, she wrote a series of articles, including this one published in the magazine Link, that led to a public boycott and a strike of 1,400 match workers. The white slavery of London match workers. Bryant and May, now a limited liability company, paid last year a dividend of 23% to its shareholders. 2 years ago it paid a dividend of 25%, and the original £5 shares were then quoted for sale at £18.60. The highest dividend paid has been 38%. Let us see how the money is made with which these monstrous dividends are paid. The hour for commencing work is 6.30 in summer and 8 in winter. Work concludes at 6 p.m. Half an hour is allowed for breakfast and an hour for dinner. This long day of work is performed by young girls, who have to stand the whole of the time. A typical case is that of a girl of 16, a piece worker. She earns 4s a week, and lives with a sister, employed by the same firm, who earns good money, as much as 8s or 9s per week. Out of the earnings 2s is paid for the rent of one room. The child lives on only bread and butter and tea, alike for breakfast and dinner, but related with dancing eyes that once a month she went to a meal where you get coffee, and bread, and butter, and jam, and marmalade, and lots of it. The splendid salary of 4s is subject to deductions in the shape of fines, if the feet are dirty, or the ground under the bench is left untidy. A fine of 3d is inflicted, for putting burnt matches that have caught fire during the work on the benches has been forfeited, and one unhappy girl was once fined 2s.60 for some unknown crime. If a girl leaves 4 or 5 matches on her bench when she goes for a fresh frame she is fined 3d, and in some departments a fine of 3d is inflicted for talking. If a girl is late she is shut out for half the day, that is for the morning 6 hours, and 5d is deducted out of her day's 8d. One girl was fined is for letting the web twist around a machine in the endeavor to save her fingers from being cut, and was sharply told to take care of the machine, never mind your fingers. Another, who carried out the instructions and lost a finger thereby, was left unsupported while she was helpless. The wage covers the duty of submitting to an occasional blow from a foreman, one, who appears to be a gentleman of variable temper, clouds them when he is mad. One department of the work consists in taking matches out of a frame and putting them into boxes. About 3 frames can be done in an hour, and the ID is paid for each frame emptied. Only 1 frame is given out at a time, and the girls have to run downstairs and upstairs each time to fetch the frame, thus much increasing their fatigue. One of the delights of the frame work is the accidental firing of the matches. When this happens the worker loses the work, and if the frame is injured she is fined or sacked. 5s a week had been earned at this by one girl I talked to. The tillers get the ID. The gross for filling boxes, at boxing, i.e. wrapping papers around the boxes, they can earn from 4s.60 to 5s a week. A very rapid tiller has been known to earn once as much as 9s5 in a week, and 6s5 a week sometimes. The making of boxes is not done in the factory, for these 2 VID. The gross is paid to people who work in their own homes, and find your own paste. Day work is a little better paid than piecework, and is done chiefly by married women, who earn as much sometimes as 10s a week, the piecework tolling to the girls. 4 women day workers, spoken of with reverent awe, earn 13s a week. A very bitter memory survives in the factory. Mr. Theodore Bryant, to show his admiration of Mr. Gladstone, and the greatness of his own public spirit, bethought him to erect a statue to that eminent statesman. In order that his work girls might have the privilege of contributing, he stopped his each out of their wages, and further deprived them of half a day's work by closing the factory, giving them a holiday. We don't want no holidays, said one of the girls pathetically, for needless to say the poorer employees of such a firm lose their wages when a holiday is given. So furious were the girls at this cruel plundering, that many went to the unveiling of the statue with stones and bricks in their pockets, and I was conscious of a wish that some of those bricks had made an impression on Mr. Bryant's conscience. Later on they surrounded the statue, we paid for it, they cried savagely, shouting and yelling, and a gruesome story is told that some cut their arms and let their blood trickle on the marble paid for, in very truth, by their blood. Such is a bald account of one form of white slavery as it exists in London. With chattel slaves Mr. Bryant could not have made his huge fortune, for he could not have fed, clothed, and housed them for 4 seconds a week each, and they would have had a definite money value which would have served as a protection. But who cares for the fate of these white wage slaves? Born in slums, driven to work while still children, undersized because underfed, oppressed because helpless, flung aside as soon as worked out, who cares if they die or go on the streets? Provided only that the Bryant and May shareholders get their 23% and Mr. Theodore Bryant can erect statues and buy parks. Oh, we had but a people's Dante, to make a special circle in the inferno for those who live on this misery, and suck wealth out of the starvation of helpless girls. Failing a poet to hold up their conduct to the execration of posterity, enshrined in deathless verse, let us strive to touch their consciences, i.e. their pockets, and let us at least avoid being partakers of their sins, by abstaining from using their commodities. 1888. Aidan Neil Chew. Born on a farm in North Staffordshire, Chew, 1870–1945, left school at the age of 11 to help her mother with taking care of house and family. In her early 20s she worked as a tailor in a factory in Crewe. She wrote a series of letters to the Crewe Chronicle about working conditions in the factory. When her identity was discovered, an uproar ensued, and she was fired. She became active in politics and continued to write for political causes. A living wage for factory girls at Crewe, May 5, 1894. Sir, will you grant me space in your sensible and widely read paper to complain of a great grievance of the class, that of tailor essays in some of the Crewe factories to which I belong? I have hoped against hope that some influential man, or woman, would take up our cause and put us in the right way to remedy, for of course there is a remedy for the evils we are suffering from. But although one cannot open a newspaper without seeing what all sorts and conditions of men are constantly agitating for and slowly but surely obtaining, as in the miners' 8-hour bill, only very vague mention is ever made of the underpaid, overworked factory girl. And I have come to the conclusion, sir, that as long as we are silent ourselves and apparently content with our lot, so long shall we be left in the enjoyment of that lot. The rates paid for the work done by us are so tearfully low as to be totally inadequate to, one had almost said, keep body and soul together. Well, sir, it is a tact which I could prove, if necessary, that we are compelled, not by our employers, but by stern necessity, in order to keep ourselves in independence, which self-respecting girls even in our class of life like to do, to work so many hours when I would rather not say how many, that light loses its savor, and our toil, which in moderation and at a fair rate of remuneration would be pleasurable, becomes drudgery of the most wearisome kind. To take what may be considered a good week's wage, the work has to be so close and unremitting that we cannot be said to live, we merely exist. We eat, we sleep, we work, endlessly, ceaselessly work, from Monday morning till Saturday night, without remission. Cultivation of the mind? How is it possible? Reading. Those of us who are determined to live like human beings and require food for mind as well as body are obliged to take time which is necessary for sleep to gratify this desire. As for recreation and enjoying the bow ties of nature, the seasons come and go, and we have barely time to notice whether it is spring or summer. Certainly we have Sundays, but Sunday is to many of us, after our week of slavery, a day of exhaustion. It has frequently been so in my case, and I am not delicate. This, you will understand, sir, is when work is plentiful. Of course we have slack times, of which the present is one, otherwise I should not have time to write to you. It may be said that we should utilize these slack times for recruiting our bodies and cultivating our minds. Many of us do so, as far as is possible in the anxious state we are necessarily in, knowing that we are not earning our keep, for it is not possible, absolutely not possible, for the average ordinary hand to earn enough in busy seasons, even with the overtime I have mentioned, to make up for slack ones. A living wage. Ours is a lingering, dying wage. Who reaps the benefit of our toil? I read sometimes of a different state of things in other tactories, and if in others, why not those in crew? I have just read the report of the Royal Commission on Labor. Very good, but while Royal Commissions are inquiring and reporting and making suggestions, some of the workers are being hurried to their graves. One am afraid I am trespassing a great deal on your space, sir, but my subject has such serious interest for me I sometimes wax very warm as sit stitching and thinking over our wrongs that day, and the knowledge that of our columns are always open to the needy, however humble, must be my excuse. I am, sir, yours sincerely, a crew factory girl crew, May 1st, 1894. Editor's note, our correspondent writes a most intelligent letter, and if she is a specimen of the factory girl, then crew factory proprietors should be proud of their hands. We shall be glad to hear further from our correspondent as to the wages paid, the numbers of hours worked, and the conditions of their employment. Crew Chronicle, May 5, 1894.